I'm hopeful because I kind of have to be. I look at the fact that official development aid is shrinking so much in the global north, and I look to, well, where is the money? It's in private sector and it's in philanthropy.
These are turbulent times for global development. Funding cuts, job losses, program suspensions. This perfect storm means even less security for the most vulnerable people in difficult and dangerous parts of the world. Joining to make sense of how things are now and what the rest of 2025 may bring is Raj Kumar. He's the founding president and editor-in-chief of Devex, the media platform for the global development community. Raj, welcome to Collab.
Thanks, Phil. Great to be with you.
Where do we find you for this call?
I'm here in exciting Washington, D.C., where there is never a dull moment right now.
That's for sure. Hey, for those who haven't heard of Devex, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of what that organization is?
Yeah, we're a news organization, but we have a particular niche, which is we focus on global development. So we're writing about what's going on at the World Bank or the UN or the Gates Foundation. And it's people who work at those institutions and the many other thousands of institutions that are related to these kind of topics: humanitarian aid, global health, sustainability, et cetera. Those are our readers. And we've got about 1 million professionals around the world who read Devex. That number's probably grown a lot in the last month or so as we've been covering what's happening here in Washington, D.C. And I think our website traffic is up 900% versus this time last year. But basically, we're journalists. We're reporters and editors who are out there just trying to figure out what's going on in this space and reporting it in plain English to an audience of professionals who need to understand it.
Recent events aside, what have been the biggest changes you've seen in the development sector?
I mean, it's changed a lot. So we did start 25 years ago as a student project, and it was the year 2000. And it was a time when the internet had just come up and, it was changing everything. And I foolishly thought, oh, it's going to change global development too, and of course it did on the margins, but at the fundamental level, it didn't change it. Development was run and governed by just a handful of big governments around the world, 5 or so big governments, mainly the US, that were funding, an alphabet soup of aid agencies, a lot of them UN agencies and others, and in a lot of ways was resistant to change. But I think over the last decade or so, there's been a lot more change. I ended up writing a book about this in 2019 called The Business of Changing the World. And really what I see is just a new business model around social entrepreneurship, new money, especially private money from foundations and others. And, new technology has just really changed the way the development sector works. So a lot has changed, I think, in 25 years, but it took a while to get going. And now, because of all the political dysfunction, it's going to change much faster than before.
So journalists are interested in facts and insights and accuracy. Information accuracy seems to be under threat around the world. Do you see this impacting development?
Oh, it's impacting everything. Yeah, so it certainly will impact development. I mean, it impacts what people understand is true, and you're seeing this now with some of the aid critics who are throwing out sometimes completely false examples. They're saying, hey, this aid has been given here for this, and it's like, when you look at it, actually, it's not real. So I think it has huge, enormous impacts. What it means for us as journalists is we just have to be more careful, more serious than ever about really being, objective, not having a dog in the fight, not being partisan in any way. In the first Trump administration, we had a great relationship with a lot of the people who worked in his administration, a lot of the officials there. And we want that to continue now in the U.S. and all around the world, because we want to get the facts to people. And of course, we have to fact check those. We provide that filter, but we still want to make sure the perspectives are really clear and there's a real open debate and understanding on these topics. And that's a big part of our role.
Okay, let's jump to current times. In late October last year, I was in the audience, fortunate to be there as you hosted Devex World in DC, and it was a wonderful day of interviews and issues and challenges, of course, but there was a positive vibe in the room. And it was 10 days or so before the election. Now, everyone knew that change was possible. And indeed, the last session was looking at political possibilities. But did anyone or did you expect this much change?
Definitely not this fast. I mean, there were debates about, sort of what is the spectrum of change that could come. And there were some people who thought it could go, really extreme, like they're going to close USAID. But that was a minority of people. Most people I talked to did not think that. And nobody I talked to thought it would happen in the first, week or something. Nobody expected that Elon Musk would, decide we would take on this huge role in the administration, first of all, and then would decide to target first and foremost foreign aid. This was, something beyond anybody's imagination. So I think people were prepared for something serious and significant. Nobody was prepared for this. And that includes, you were at that conference we hosted where we had some of the authors of Project 2025. They themselves were shocked by this. In the beginning, they thought this is going to be the Project 2025 plan for aid and development. And then actually it was overtaken by the Doge people who have a different vision, which was much less about reform, constructive reform, and much more just about cutting. And that's what we've experienced so far.
How do you summarize the biggest changes that have kicked in? I mean, let's start with the USA, but what's actually happened?
I mean, approximately a 90% reduction in the staff at USAID, which is was the world's largest bilateral aid agency. Approximately a 90% reduction in its projects. This is, way more extreme than was ever expected, and a sense that, the administration, to the extent they have the legal authority or can muscle it through anyway, there's a sense that USAID is no more. That it doesn't exist, and that it will be, in some part of the State Department, it might be broken up into pieces where the health work could go to CDC, and the agriculture work to the U.S. Agriculture Department, and so USAID, it feels, has ceased to exist. Now, it's not over. I'm using a lot of conditional language here because there's active lawsuits, and went all the way to the Supreme Court. Which ruled at least somewhat in the favor of plaintiffs, development organizations that are looking to get paid for work they already did, which they have not been paid for. I mean, there's billions of dollars just sitting out there that have not been paid, that are owed. So it's very much a live, active debate, but it feels like if the president gets his way, USAID is no more. There will be massive reductions, could be 90%, maybe it ends up being less. But that level of reduction in staffing and in a project portfolio. So, it's hard to overstate how extreme this situation is. And we're still feeling out what it means for all the subsidiary organizations around the world that get money from the U.S. government, right? The U.S. government is by far the biggest funder. So, something like 47% of humanitarian aid comes from the U.S. So the knock-on effects to UN agencies, to other multilaterals, it's just massive. And we're still trying to get a handle around that.
So something like 10,000 projects denied funding.
Yeah, that's the number that's out there. There is still no official list from the administration, and I can't overstate how chaotic this has been. So many development organizations are getting an email. They get an email that says from, without a name. It'll come from a generic email address at USAID or the State Department, and it will say, "We are canceling your project for convenience," quote unquote, which is a contractual term of art. And some of these are very large projects that are, currently saving lives. And they'll get an email to that effect. That's it. The emails, interestingly enough, end with "Thank you and God bless America." Those emails can then be followed by another email from someone else inside the same agency saying, "Hey, hang on. Actually, your project is not canceled. It's not terminated. It's ongoing." And then another email will come and say, no, hang on, it is canceled, and this can go on. So it gets to even stranger. There are aid agencies getting emails about projects being canceled that their organization doesn't run, and they have to share it with other organizations who actually do run the project. So there is mass chaos here. So when you say, is it 10,000? I'm not obfuscating by saying I don't know exactly. No one seems to know.
Let's think about people who work in the sector to start. A lot of despair. Do you detect some resilience?
A lot of despair. I mean, understandable, right? Because these are folks who, they never saw this coming, right? They thought, I have a government job. I work in the federal government, a foreign service officer overseas. Many of them move with their families, with their children. They're in school. They're there for a multi-year project. They didn't expect something like this would come in days. They thought they would see it coming a little bit more, right? There'd be a debate in Congress. They would talk about cutting budgets. They would talk about, staff reductions. And then eventually, a year or 2 years down the road, it could affect them. So I think there has been a lot of real despair because of how dramatically this has been handled and the language around it, calling USAID a criminal organization, talking about people, engaging in fraud and using really heavy language. I mean, there's just reporting this week that, the State Department official who's leading a lot of these efforts apparently told Congress that he's considering criminal legal action against USAID staff that he feels have not listened to the president's directives in those early days around who to fund and who not to fund. So you can't really overstate the emotions here. People are really feeling them, and they have good reason to feel them. I mean, you've got families where sometimes a couple, both partners were working in USAID or in organizations funded by USAID. And now suddenly both jobs are lost, and it's not clear they can get another one because the whole sector is affected. So there is quite a bit of despair. Is there resilience? I mean, look, people who work in this field, a lot of them are geared toward crisis, right? That's their work. Now it's coming home. It's different, but they're geared toward it. So you are seeing a lot of resilience. You're seeing people helping each other. There's a lot of that. It's really heartwarming to see. I hosted a call just days after all this news came out for people at USAID who lost their jobs. I had 2,700 people join this call live on Zoom, and it was heartbreaking. But on the other hand, it was so heartwarming to see just the emotions from people supporting each other. One former USAID staff person, he's a professional photographer, and he said, "I'll take headshots for anyone free who needs them for their resume or for their LinkedIn profile." There were just people trying to help each other, and that was great to see.
Of course, the biggest impact are on people who need support, people needing HIV medicines, people who need food in places like Sudan. So that is perhaps being forgotten as well. Some of us think about the sector and people, but I mean, the work that is done is about uplifting and supporting people in need. And there are millions and millions of those people right now.
Yeah, that's probably the worst part for a lot of these people, because imagine you get this terrible news, you're losing your job, you're worried about your kid's school, et cetera. But on top of that, you're in charge of a program that is feeding kids. And now you have to tell the people who you're sending money to, sorry, the money stopped. Like, not only have you lost a job, but the impacts it's going to have. You mentioned Sudan. We've done a survey to try to better understand what's going on. We interviewed a couple thousand people in the sector, and we heard in Sudan there are 38 health centers that have closed, and those 38 health centers served about 550,000 people. So that's 500,000 people that have nowhere to go when they have a health crisis. And that's just like a drop in the bucket. In Kenya, 54,000 healthcare workers were told, "Don't show up to the hospital you work at because we can't pay you." So the ripple effects globally are being felt already, but we're still trying to understand the effect of it. But it is going to be massive. I mean, USAID was spending $60 billion a year. That's a lot of money anywhere. In the context and the geographies we're talking about, those are huge sums.
Do you have a sense that in the months ahead, the whole idea of the soft power that America has through its aid program, the rationale for that will become more understood and need to change?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's 3 venues for this, maybe 4. There's the White House, the executive branch, and clearly the way they've gone with Doge taking the lead has been as extreme as you could imagine. The other venue is the courts. They're getting engaged. There's a lot more to be done there, but so far there's some good signs, and especially the Supreme Court decision. So it looks like there will be some backup from the courts. The next venue is the Congress. And the Congress has really not acted so far. They've been pretty quiet. What we hear is that Republican members don't agree with this. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to paint them all with a broad brush. It depends on the member, but many of them are longstanding supporters of foreign assistance. They might be skeptics of some parts of it. They might disagree with some of what the Biden administration did with it, but they generally don't want to see a 90% cut. They're concerned about what that means for America's role in the world, and in addition to the humanitarian and moral questions at play. So there's a hope that as the Congress becomes a more important venue for this debate, as they will, because they've got to debate the budget, that they will assert some of their authority. And they will say, look, we got to come up with a budget. Maybe we won't allocate as much as we allocated in the last budget, but we're going to allocate something, maybe half, maybe 3/4 of what we allocated last time. But importantly, we're going to say the administration has to spend this money. This is the key thing, Phil, that maybe your listeners who aren't as close to U.S. constitutional issues may not realize, but there's kind of a constitutional tussle happening here. The way things have worked for the last 50 years is the Congress appropriates money, the president and the executive spends that money. This White House has a different view. They say the Congress appropriates a ceiling of how much money the president can spend, but it's not a floor. The president can reduce as much as he might want to that spending for good reasons, like, hey, this doesn't align with my America First foreign policy. So there's a real tug of war here. If that really plays out and Congress is able to get back some of its authority, there is a chance we end up with the pendulum swinging back somewhere closer to the middle. What exactly that looks like, nobody really knows right now. Most people think no more USAID, that USAID is not coming back, but that maybe a much larger percentage of its programs could.
Okay, turning to the withdrawal of the US from the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement, have those things taken effect immediately, or are there built-in time delays there?
Yeah, it's sort of yes and no. There are built-in time delays, but the U.S. administration is taking as much advantage as they can of the fine print. So not even necessarily paying their back dues. Forget about the money that they might owe during a waiting period. So this is one of the key issues we're tuned into at Devex, is not just whether or not a program or a funding stream is approved, but whether the payment is actually made. Because that's the piece that has been stopped across the board when it comes to some of these international organizations, but also when it comes to many of the U.S. domestic organizations that get funding for international work. So that's the key one that we're paying a lot of attention to, and that's a very much a live issue.
Are you aware of U.S. disinvestment from other UN bodies or organizations like the World Bank? Is that something that's been discussed?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about the UN bodies, and many of them have seen their funding stopped. And they are applying for and pushing for waivers. There's a whole process underway under which that may happen or may not, depending on the UN agency. Some are going to be hit harder than others, like UNFPA, which the administration has long disagreed with, UNESCO, but even others like IOM that works on migration. They're in some real trouble too. So we've been doing some reporting on this. It's a mixed bag depending on the agency. Generally speaking, these agencies are in real trouble with the UN. Some of them get more than 40% of their budget from the US government. So even if the budget gets trimmed from the US side, it's going to have big knock-on effects for these agencies. The World Bank is a fascinating one. We don't know yet. There's been no indication from this administration. The Project 2025 document did talk about a US withdrawal. Now, if that were to happen, it's just so dramatic to even contemplate it. Yeah, I've lived in Washington 25 years or more now, 30 years or so on and off. The World Bank headquarters is in Washington. It's like an important center in D.C. You've got 10,000 employees and a whole ecosystem around it. By the charter of the World Bank, they would have to move out of Washington, D.C. if the U.S. withdrew. And they have to go to whatever country is the largest shareholder. Well, the second largest right now is Japan. They have 7%. The U.S. is 17%. But if the U.S. pulled out, it would cause a new need to recapitalize the bank. And China, by all rights, would be the second largest. If they were allowed to, they would invest enough to be the second largest. And then the World Bank might move to Beijing, which I feel like symbolically there's no better example of, what's going on or how dramatic these potential changes are. But right now we're in wait and see mode, and obviously it's something we're listening to and following very closely at Devex.
So looking beyond America, governments are cutting foreign aid, aren't they, to free up money for increased defence spending in some cases. Belgium, I saw, reported cutting aid by 25%. The UK going from a 0.5% of GNI to 0.3 by 2027. Do you see this happening elsewhere?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was at the Munich Security Conference just a few weeks ago, and I think the big takeaway there was the transatlantic alliance has broken down. There's just no trust at this point, no faith. And so countries that would have normally said, we can trust the U.S. to defend us, they're realizing not just because the U.S. has told them, we want you to spend more on defense, but because they don't have this sense that they can trust the U.S., they're looking to spend more on their own defense. So in the case of the UK, they're doing a 40% cut of their foreign aid budget and moving it all directly into defense. Now, the thing they're doing that's different from the US is that they're doing it over a period of like 1 to 2 years, right? They're going to work their way into those cuts. So it's much less dramatic and chaotic than what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. But these cuts are everywhere. I mean, Switzerland is cutting its budget. Germany has cut its budget. Now we'll see what happens with the new government. Maybe there's a chance to restore some of it, but you can understand why, they're doing this. And the global north is sitting on these acute issues that we've talked about, but also they got aging populations. They've got growing healthcare and pension obligations. They got a lot of debt. So it's not as though this is just a one-off where you're likely to see them cut and then they'll spend more next year. This is, more of a structural issue that is going to take longer for them to get out of. And so I think that the development funding picture is going to look different for a long time to come.
Let's look towards the end of this year and into 2026, the trends, challenges. You recently wrote that this turbulent time was akin to old aid, being like an iceberg entering warming waters.
I've been watching this development sector for a couple of decades, right? And, people talked about reform, they talked about change, but it's been a very slow sector to change. And a lot of that's because so much of the money is government. And government, of course, is very risk averse. And then the other big bucket of money is philanthropy. And philanthropy might be willing to take more risks in theory, but they often tend to be pretty risk averse too. And they have their own, peculiarities and vagaries where, they're not necessarily driven by markets and market mechanisms. There's not a lot of accountability there either, frankly. So development has just been kind of slow to move. And what I wrote about in that piece, I said, we might be slow to move because we haven't been forced to before, but now the waters are warming and this iceberg is melting. And I was referring to some of the things I just talked about, which is that the politics around bilateral aid are getting harder and harder. At the same time, the climate's getting warmer, there's more conflict. So a greater share of bilateral aid budgets has to go to humanitarian aid, even as those bilateral aid buckets start to shrink and shrink and shrink. Now, I never thought they would shrink this fast. When I wrote that piece, I knew they were shrinking, but they are shrinking much faster than ever before, especially led by the U.S. So I just think that we're in a moment when that melting iceberg means you've got to form something new. You have to come up with a new model of development. And that's a lot of what I was trying to point our readers to, is that a lot of things we've slowly talked about as fringe issues, cash transfers, social enterprises, big bets in philanthropy, development finance, impact investing, those things have been on the fringe. They're going to become the center. And they have to. There's simply no choice in the matter. The big money has to come from the private sector. And it has to be crowded in. And we know what a lot of the tools are to do this. We know guarantees, development finance, first loss capital. We know foundations getting engaged in creating markets and de-risking markets and building the infrastructure for markets. We know a lot of it. It just hasn't come to scale before. And I'm really hopeful that the thin silver lining of this chaos that we're seeing in the political realm of development aid is going to lead to a new moment, a new vision that ultimately might not only address some of the immediate challenges, but get past some of the problems of the old system. I mean, it's not like the old system is something I really want to defend. It was a system that was very global north centered. It wasn't providing enough aid to the people on the ground, enough agency either. It wasn't always the most efficient. So while I don't agree that, there was a lot of fraud and abuse, I don't think so at all. I think the opposite. There was almost none, almost too little, because it was so constrained and tightened down that there was no room for people to make risky decisions on the ground, right? And so I'm hopeful we get to a new model that doesn't replicate the problems of the past and that lets us find new ways of achieving real results for people using market mechanisms, putting decision-making authority in the hands of people who are in their own communities, and unlocking the power of technology to just drive a lot of this, much faster than ever before.
So you're describing a huge wave of localization. I read recently a leading African figure talking about the situation and the sort of chaos, but saying, well, actually bring it on because the old system was not working, echoing exactly what you've been saying. And it's time for agency and more local control and better results on the ground. So that's a view that's held quite widely in the sector.
I feel like in our sector, people whispered about wanting reform because they were scared if they said it out loud, it would lead to governments finding excuses to cut. And boy, those issues have really come to pass now, right? And I can't help but think, had we been more forward-leaning on reform for the last 10 years or the last 20 years, that maybe it would have made it much harder for these kinds of radical cuts to take place. But clearly, we didn't do a good enough job telling the story, proving the results, proving the cost effectiveness of this work. Otherwise, it wouldn't be this easy to demolish all of this, certainly here in Washington. So I hope we can take something away from that, and that this new model, I wouldn't even call it localization, because localization itself is a very top-down idea. It's like, I've got all the marbles, but I'm going to give you some because I want to localize. I think we need to have a very different results-oriented revolution, a results revolution that says, all right, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to achieve economic growth. We want, literacy higher. We want kids not to die before their 5th birthday. What are we trying to achieve? There's people and ideas and technology out there to help achieve these things. How do we unleash all of that potential and fund the things that are most successful, the things that have the best return on investment, and create more of a market dynamic? I don't mean when I say a market like that this has to be for-profit companies making money off of this. I just mean a market where the best ideas bubble up. And chances are those are going to come from the communities that are impacted, who are going to pull themselves out of poverty. It's not going to be someone coming in from overseas who does that.
Of course, we've had a massive list, very clear list of things we wanted to achieve. They were called the SDGs. What's the future for them? Are they still alive, or are they being reworked now?
I think they're alive in part because the private sector really embraced the SDGs. They love the idea of a framework. The private sector, they want to know, what are the metrics? What are the goals? And so being able to apply that was useful to them. Whereas I think others, particularly in the NGO sector, they looked at this as more of a problem. They said, it's complicated. It's hard to message to our donor audiences, to the public. But I think because the private sector has latched onto it so much, I think the SDGs will continue to have some value as we go forward to 2030. But they too, as we look at what comes after the SDGs, it's going to have to be very different. It is. And I'm not sure what that is. I've heard, different perspectives. Some people lamenting that we got away from something like the MDGs, which were the Millennium Development Goals, were just, really clear and simple. There were fewer of them. Everybody could understand them. And so I've heard that. I've heard other people saying, we got to get completely away from this sort of top-down structure. So I don't know what comes next after 2030. All I know is we're going to be facing these challenges for generations. Like this, the issues we're talking about, whether it's climate change or inequality or poverty or the health inequities, these aren't getting solved by 2030, let alone by 2050. I mean, some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they spend annually on healthcare $100, $200 per person, right? What people might spend on a fancy dinner in the global north is spent on annual healthcare costs. That's a gap you're not going to close very simply, right? And so if you believe in trying to ensure everybody on this planet has basic opportunities in life and access to basic healthcare and education as a human right, we're going to need a model to get there. And maybe it's not the SDGs, maybe they don't fit in this era. Let's see. But we're going to need something to take that place.
So to wrap up, things to look for in the coming year, some new and increased business involvement and activity, more localized, more agency on the ground. Anything else particular I've missed?
Well, foundations. So, part of the wealth inequality that's grown in the world has led to 17 individuals who are now worth over $100 billion. I mean, that is wild. I remember when nobody was worth $100 billion, when that milestone was reached. There's now 17 people that are there. If they were to become philanthropic in the way that Bill Gates has, this would transform philanthropy and global development. If even a few of them were to become philanthropic at that level, it would transform this space. And my thinking is you're going to start to see more and more of this kind of philanthropy. It's not an unalloyed good. It's not like, oh, this is going to be easy and great, because you could have philanthropists who have very weird ideas and there's no accountability and they start funding those and they maybe could distort markets. Who knows? But I'm hopeful because I kind of have to be. I look at the fact that official development aid is shrinking so much in the global north, and I look to, well, where is the money? It's in the private sector and it's in philanthropy, and we need both of them. And so I'm hopeful that more philanthropists seeing the challenges in the world are going to realize they don't have to go and replicate USAID, but they can find ways to use their fortune to actually drive real change in the world. Impactful change that will go down in history. I'm sure Bill Gates, one day, he wants his legacy to be more than just an amazing technology innovator. He wants to be known as the person who ended polio, right? Or ended malaria. People have all kinds of opinions and disagreements about this level of wealth. I get that. I do too. But I'd much rather there are people with those kinds of goals and ambitions out there. And I want to see more people with those kinds of goals and ambitions. And I think we will see more of that in the coming years.
Would you recommend a career in international development to young people, and why?
I really would, because I don't know, what else there is to do, but to try to have a career where you connect impact in some way with your work. It doesn't have to be international development. It could be local. You could be doing something in your own community. But my own takeaway from life is it's way too short to, if you have the opportunity, to just be thinking about your own material well-being. Not everybody has that opportunity, but if you can do something, however small, that integrates your career between mission and purpose and a job that pays the bills, that's the holy grail. That's where you want to be. And international development, the needs are massive. There's enormous opportunity for your talents and your insights, but it's going to look very different from the way it's looked before. That's a good thing. And we need young people to come and innovate this and build this new sector. So I would do nothing but encourage them to get into this field. And I would just say, don't think about it as, well, I've got to learn, how government agencies work in global development. Come to this field with knowledge of finance, with knowledge of technology, with technical skills. Bring those and bring your passion and entrepreneurship. And I think there will be a real career for you here.
Fantastic. Finally, what have you read, watched, or listened to recently that you would recommend to Collab subscribers, and why?
Well, you're making me think of an interview I just did this week with a guy named Soji Adeyi, who is a global health leader and expert. He ran the World Bank's global health division for years. And that's worth watching, because Soji surprised even me, because I know he's got always a different viewpoint, but he really was leaning into the idea that the old system doesn't make any sense and we've got to stop defending it. and stop lamenting the fact that it's dying, and we need to shape it in a new way. He really wants us to see even big global institutions, UN and multilateral institutions, have a plan to shut down and to move their functions to the country level and to the regional and sub-regional level. And I just thought, I don't necessarily agree with everything he said, but it's a radical idea, and we need some radical ideas right now. We can't just be on the receiving end of radical ideas. I think it's time for people who want to see a better world and want to be a proactive force in that to come up with their own big vision and their own big ideas. And I hope that interview might spark for people some ideas.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your insights and your time. And we wish you all the best in the year ahead. And perhaps, listen, you're an articulate, well-connected DC insider. You're very well placed to talk to some of those multi-billionaires and encourage them. I'm sure perhaps you're doing some of that work already.
Yeah, doing what I can, Phil. It is an interesting time, let me tell you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Collab is a new podcast series from the International Development Unit at the New Zealand Science Institute, Plant and Food Research. Presented by me, Phil Johnstone, with original music by Miller Yule and editing by JD Lowe at Fratelli Media. For info about the impact of our Institute's international development work, visit plantandfoodresearch.com. And check out the show notes for links and how to send feedback and topic suggestions for future episodes. Thanks for listening. Till next time.